would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it.
There we go.
All right. Tonight I'm connected with Paul Edward Rana, hailing from Texas. He's a translator of source texts, an author, editor, lecturer, esotericist, artist, designer, sixth dan black belt master in multiple schools of martial arts, yoga instructor, past master of Martinist, Rosicrucian, and Golden Dawn bodies, an ordained bishop with French, Gnostic, and Orthodox Apostolic succession, currently Grand Master of the OMS, Order Martinists Sovereigns, and I would say an all-around scientist of the divine, aka Ninja Paul. Welcome to the podcast.
Paul. Thanks for having me on, Sky. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. I could have just kept going with your intro there because there's definitely a lot to you. But before we get into it, is there anything else additional that you'd like to add about yourself or your background for listeners?
I think you covered it pretty well.
Right.
You know, I mean, like you said, I stay really busy. Anything that I do, I try to go all the way. And I've just been a student of the occult arts and mysticism since I was a kid, pretty much.
That's awesome. Did I see that you recently received another black belt of some kind? I think I saw something on the social media.
Yeah. A few months ago, I went down to Brazil and took a Masonic delegation down there and met with members of the Grand Orient of Brazil in Rio Grande do Sul. And while we were there, we did Masonic lectures, Masonic rituals, Martinist rituals, Gnostic ordinations, and then also found time to test for my 6th degree black belt under Grandmaster Alexander Gomes.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, you're definitely a busy person. All right, so you're one of the more well-versed that I've come across in terms of like Kabbalistic knowledge and understandings. So I kind of want to start with the Kabbalah. I think it was you that said
Sure.
the following, and I really liked it as a summary of Kabbalah. I think you said Kabbalah is about understanding man's relationship with creation, the understanding of the inward qualities of the self, and how they work in conjunction with universal law. I think that's awesome. And I was just wondering, is there anything else that you would add to that as a kind of brief description of Kabbalah in general?
Yeah. I mean, Kabbalah is it's the mystical tradition of Judaism. And there are several types of Kabbalah. There's several streams ranging from kosher rabbinical Kabbalah to Hermetic Kabbalah, which is what most people study nowadays, post-Golden Dawn. But it's all about the nature of the universe, understanding the relationships between God, man, and the universe. So both between your microcosm and the divine, and your microcosm and the macrocosm. And these principles apply on all three of those levels. You can use them to study the nature of deity, the nature of the macrocosmos, or in the nature of yourself to better know thyself and the universe and the gods.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I have a few questions about things relating to Kabbalah. First, I think maybe it would be cool to ask you if you would give maybe just a little kind of like overview and discuss the origins of Kabbalah as far back as we can trace it and kind of how it made its way up into its modern day like dissemination? How did that all, where did it come from, and how did it all come into how it is now?
So you'll probably get, I mean, there's a number of ways to answer that, obviously, right? One of them being that Kabbalah, according to rabbinical tradition and the Zohar, will teach that it was first taught to Adam by the angel, or more specifically, that Adam was taught by the archangel Metatron himself, which would be the highest archangel. Eventually, it was replaced by Enoch. Enoch ascended and became Metatron. So that's the mythological origin, right? Is that Adam learned the secrets of the mysteries of the divine directly from the angels. But as far as a more factual understanding, Kabbalah, it comes from the Latin medieval Kabbalah or the Hebrew Kabbalah, which means tradition or correspondence. And that comes from the root of kibel, to receive or to accept. The import is that it's an oral tradition of Jewish faith, Judeo-Christian origins, that is given from the instructive tongue to the attentive ear. So just like Freemasonry, it's all done mouth to ear. And this interplay is a dynamic giving and receiving, which is meant to result in the illumination of the soul. Some of the oldest texts, obviously, the Holy Kabbalah is a mystical interpretation of the Old Testament, specifically the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, especially the Pentateuch. And it probably reached its height of its influence in kosher Kabbalah in the Middle Ages. And this is when you see texts like the Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar coming out. These are basically commentaries and midrashes upon the Old Testament. So take the Zohar, for example. You have 3 rabbis sitting in a circle or a triangle, and they're rapping over every single line of Genesis. So the Zohar begins with that first line of Genesis, Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. And darkness is upon the face of the deep. So you start with this. And they basically go around robin. To make it simple, you could say that one rabbi might give a interpretation of the pillar severity, so like a martial Gabora influence. The other one might give an interpretation of chesed, so a merciful aspect of the pillar of mercy. And then there's going to be the one in the center who's going to give you that Tiferet balance point. It's always about the balance, right? Kabbalah, Judaism, Masonry, it's all about these opposites. The opposites we call the pillars, whether that is masculine, feminine, heaven and earth, light and dark, positive, negative. But the point is to balance these pillars and bring them into the Trinity, where all 3 can communicate with each other. So that's really where it starts. And then you have an oral tradition that's passed down. You have these books that begin getting codified. And it was highly Jewish at first, but as early as Pico della Mirandola, you start seeing Christian Kabbalists come around. And you start seeing the influence of Gnostic Christianity coming into Kabbalah. And this evolves as Hermeticism comes back into the mix in the Renaissance, as Rosicrucianism unveils itself in 1614, as Masonry unveils itself officially in 1717, we could say with the Grand Lodge of England. And nowadays, most people are going to be studying the tradition of the Golden Dawn. So the 1888 magical order that codified the trees of life that you see kind of vaguely over there.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
And that color system.
That's a great description. And so I have a few questions, just different things relating to Kabbalah. So let's see. I love the videos. First, I want to say I love the videos that you have available online, because you're really like clear and concise as a teacher. And there's so many good little tidbits in there and little small things that I've learned. Like just for example, you mentioned something that kind of gave me a little bit of clarification when contemplating how the tree of life corresponds to the physical body. You said basically if you're to draw it out, or if you're facing it, if you were to turn around and then kind of back into the diagram, then it would kind of apply effectively as it's to be represented in correspondence with your actual body.
Right.
So I was kind of thinking about that, and I was thinking about, like the spheres and the energetic dynamics and their applications to the body. And this might be kind of like a weird question, I don't know, but So say a person is standing and you have these spheres of the tree that's representative of the particular energy centers. Like, because when I look at the diagram representing the body in relation to the tree, usually it's depicted with, the hands down. In the diagram, it'll show a person with its hands down, and then the spheres are all proportionately allocated in their own particular spots. So I was wondering, like, okay, say if I put my arm up to my head or something, and the spheres being associated with my arms, would these spheres actually energetically mix on some level, like in the diagram, or does it not really work like that? Or
I would say, well, let's say first of all that the concept of backing oneself into the tree and turning around so that Gavora, I think am I mirrored? I guess not. Okay, right side, right side.
yeah.
So I'm mirrored right now with you. This is my right side, so this would be Gavora. It looks different in the camera. I'm not sure what's going on. But right side Gavora, left side Kesed. So it is correct in the picture. The spheres we consider stationary. So Keter is always your crown. Hakma is always going to be this side of your brain. This side of your brain's Bina. Gavora, Chesed. It's not so much that like Gavora is your hand and now it's moving and changing position. The concept is that these are filtering down various layers, various reflected triangles. So consider them stable. Your heart, moving your hand to your heart isn't going to necessarily mix Tiferet and Keter.
Okay.
But what you can do in meditation is to focus on a part of your body. If you want to tap into your Gavora force, you can focus on that sphere, a red sphere, if you want to start with a basic image, or a blue sphere to bring in more passive, receptive nature of Kesed, et cetera, et cetera. But I wouldn't necessarily think that like if I do a high kick, now I've got, Netzach up at
Yeah, I was wondering, like, maybe there was some kind of yogic moves that might have interblended the different spheres, but it was just a thought, so kind of a weird one, but that
there can
answers
be
my question.
ways there can be definitely ways that you can activate spheres using yogic work. Just like in the seven chakras, there's different mantras or poses you can do to open up your sacral chakra or your muladhara or your heart center. You can definitely do exercises to open those things up, but I wouldn't say that they necessarily move where they're at.
Okay, that makes sense. So one thing that I definitely love about you is you're very flexible and diverse in terms of like your ability to understand and discuss multiple symbol sets and systems, and you'll often kind of point out how they may differ system to system. They might not necessarily always agree with each other, but the ways in which they're useful and unique. And so yeah, you don't strike me at all as like ideologically rigid in that sense towards a lot of these things, as far as what I've observed
No way.
and listening to you. I'm sure that's probably kind of like a as within, so without thing within your personal life and your kind of ability to dance between all these various things like martial arts and music and
Yeah,
esoteric
I think
studies
in
and all.
general people are too stiff and rigid.
Definitely.
And the goal of yoga, for example, one of the goals of yoga is to be more flexible physically, but also mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. A lot of people get hung up on, I don't know, let's say something bad happened in their life or some kind of a conflict with a person. We can learn to let go of those things and be more fluid, then we don't have to get sucked into it so much.
Yeah, and it's cool
And
because
likewise with systems.
sorry, go ahead.
With esoteric systems, you need to approach the system on its own terms. So, like when we're looking at Martinist or Elus Coen diagrams, it may be helpful to at first consider Kabbalistic concepts like kosher Kabbalah or Hermetic Kabbalah, but we eventually need to put that aside and understand the tradition on its own terms. Otherwise, we start to blend syncretically to where it's not beneficial and it gets muddy instead of being a clear system.
Definitely. Yeah, and I love also like one of the things that you often point out is in terms of yogas, there's a lot of people are mostly familiar with like the physical yoga, but there's also like was it hatha yoga, like the yoga of the mind, and all these various yogas, and I like that, and I think that that's really cool because you address that in a lot of the stuff I've listened to you talk about.
Yeah, Raja Yoga, the spiritual or kingly yoga, it's just as alchemical and spiritual as anything we do in Kabbalah or in the Western tradition. There's a reason why Golden Dawn members called Kabbalah the yoga of the West. And Americans, the Westerners, are really missing out if they're not tapping into the original teachings of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and things like that, that'll really broaden their perspective and give you what yoga is meant to do, which is not just an exercise and stretch.
Yeah. So, as I've been kind of like attempting to familiarize myself more deeply with the various Kabbalistic views, all kinds of interesting questions come to mind. And something that I found interesting was like with the four worlds as they apply to the Kabbalistic tree of life. So we've got Absoluth, like the archetypal world, and Bria, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing these words incorrect, the creative world, Yetzirah, the formative world, and then Asaya, the material world. So I've seen each of these worlds depicted as their own trees and, in and of themselves, and then linking together in a like an ordinary fashion
Jacob's ladder.
Yeah, for example, like Malkuth of Atziluth is the Keter of Bria, and then the Malkuth of Bria is the Keter of Yetzirah, and so on. So I thought that was cool and interesting, and I was just curious, is that like an understanding or view that you work with in yourself, and what kind of insight might be understood by linking them together in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are kosher Kabbalistic conceptions, not just Hermetic. There's a writer, Halevi ben Shimon, or Shimon ben Halevi. Halevi is his last name, Halevi.
Okay.
And he's got a great book called Kabbalah and Exodus that lays out the classical story of Exodus, which we're all familiar with at least to a degree, even if you're not a Jew or a Christian. Everyone's at least familiar with the concept. And he goes through the story and lays out the tree of life as four separate worlds, like you were saying, applying to, fire yud, absolute, so the highest spiritual world, to the next one down, the spiritual world of Bria, and the emotions and water, down to Yetzirah and the formative world, the astral plane, the mind, and then finally down to Asiya, the material physical world. But he'll go through and he'll lay out all of those separate and then also connect them as one large tree. And the way it connects is that starting from Keter of Absolute, the Malkut of Absolute is actually the Tiferet of Bria. So the Keter of Bria is the Tiferet of Absolute. So the Tiferet of each world becomes the Keter of the next world. And he lays it all down and he shows how the Israelites going from Egypt, how they cross the Red Sea, where this crosses the path of Tav, and how various the pillars of light and darkness. And he shows how every step of the way they're going ascending up the tree. So it really makes a palatable way of understanding these things that aren't so abstract. You have these classical stories we're familiar with, these exoteric stories to help comprehend that. And once you really integrate the tree of life in four worlds, it becomes a tool for out-of-body experience. It becomes a tool just like Robert Bruce's astrodynamics, where he talks about visualizing the rope you're going to climb up to pop out of your body. You can do that using the tree of life in four worlds. And that's why I've made all those diagrams in the flashing colors to help people visualize those things, to have a visual aid. Because I find visual aids very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that it's so interesting, the layers to all of it. It's fascinating. Another question that I have, I've seen a couple different like breakdowns of the four worlds as they apply. Let's see. So okay, so we have Absoluth is consisting only of Kether, and then the world of Bria consisting of Benha and Hokmah, and then Yetzirah consisting of Geburah, Hesed, Tifereth, and Hod, or Hod, Netzik, and Yesod. Then finally the world of Asaya, just Malkuth. So I wonder, what version do you go with personally, or do you have like a model where you apply the four worlds to the tree in this way? Because I've seen different, like some of them don't necessarily agree, at least what I've seen in the different.
So the Golden Dawn really fleshes a lot of that out in their grade system, especially in the 4=7 grade of Philosophus. And all those things happen at once. They're all different ways of looking at the same thing. So you can take just one tree, and the way you broke it down, you can take that one tree and apply Yod He Vav He, apply the four worlds within one tree. You can also split it into four separate 10 Sephiroth trees. And the lineup you said there was totally correct. It's just different ways of conceiving this.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the idea that absolute is only composed of Keter, it's because Keter is unknowable, relatively. We can only know it through its manifestations and its reflections in Da'at or Tiferet, let's say. But that tip of the Yud, I guess I'm going to mirror this since I'm on camera. The tip of the Yud, that's kind of weird drawing it backwards. That tip of the Yud just touches the Ein Sof and then draws down into Hakma. The bottom tip of the Yud will touch into Hakma. So that's absolute, right? And then Hakma, or you can say that absolute can be all three of the supernal triads. Either way works. Bria being perhaps Hakma Bina, and then Bina, consider it being split, because Bina and then the Ruach, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, is going to be the Ruach. So that's your thinking center, that's your personality center, whereas absolute is your spiritual center. And then Yetzirah is the Ruach. The Nefesh is going to be composed of Yesod and Malkut as the Guf. So all those things are applicable. And there's just different ways of looking at it and using different formulas.
Yeah. Okay.
And the Golden Dawn intentionally has you study all of those to have a well-rounded understanding of all the different forms of the tree.
Awesome. Okay. And then so another thing that I found interesting that I had mentioned to you before, the 4 corresponding Hebrew letters of the Yod, He, Vav, He. And the Yod as Atzilut, the He as Bria, Vav as Yetzirah, then He again as Asaya. So I thought this was interesting because He is used to represent 2 individual worlds, one being Bria and then one being Asaya. So I was wondering, like, is that weird to you? Or I think, they would each have like a unique one, but maybe not. How do you kind of like think about that?
So what they're applying there, they're applying the Tetragrammaton, the Old Testament deity, to the tree of life, because the conception is the tree of life is the body of God. It is the body of the universe and the body of man, or the model by which the body of the first man was made, Adam Kadmon. So Yud He Vav He has 2 He's, right? It's commonly spelled with a He final, that little dot in the center, to differentiate.
Okay.
And one way to conceiving this, just like when you look at the Yod He Vav He on one tree, you can put Yud into Hakma, He into Bina, Vav into the sun, the extended phallus, right? And then He being Malkut. And those are also we call the parts of them. Parts of them mean the faces, the personalities, the persons. So you have Yud, the king, obviously in a masculine position is Hakma. Bina, the great mother, the dark mother, the transcendental mother, as and then you have Vav, the son, obviously, S-O-N and S-U-N, and then the daughter, final He. So that shows a relationship. I gotta keep mirroring my hands. That shows a relationship between Bina and Malkut. That they're both the feminine aspects of the divine persons. One is the mother, one is the daughter. Or later in Kabbalah, you'll call this the exiled princess, Malkut. That exiled princess is what we're seeking to reunite with Zorin Pin, with Vav, with the sun. Because the idea is that in the fall of man, in Genesis, the fall of man, the mother and the father split and turned away from each other. They became divorced. And when they did, Adam and Eve fell. So the whole tree drops down a ladder. The darkness awakens, the Klipot, and the prince and princess no longer remember each other. They're divorced as well. So it's all about this sexual union, both within and without. And all Kabbalah is about this giving and receiving, pitching and catching, right? To give and to receive. So it's all about this polarity here. And it's just another way to use these conceptions to personify these very abstract concepts we're dealing with.
Okay. That's actually very informative. Okay, this is kind of, I was just thinking about this as you were talking, but kind of backtracking a little bit. But in Genesis, I wonder what your opinion is, because I've seen different people have their opinions about when it says Elohim, there's this idea of it being a plurality. And I don't know if you've come across that or what you think about that, or,
So, the term in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashmayim va'at haaretz. Now, the word that is translated as God in our English Bibles, Elohim, that is a feminine plural of a masculine singular. So El, Aleph Lamed, is a singular masculine name. Elohim is plural, and it's generally in Kabbalah considered to represent the 7 forces of creation. That can be 7 aspects of deity. It can later be kind of on a lower level, turned to like the 7 archangels, the prism of light, the 7 planets. They can also become archonic depending on the system you're using. But the conception here, which the Elus Coen makes use of in their first degree initiation, symbolic apprentice, is that man is being formed, man and the universe are being formed by the 7 creative forces of God through the 6 or 7 days of creation, 6 days and 1 day of rest, right? So it is definitely a plural name being used there, the Elohim.
Interesting. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
And there are some English Bibles out there that do say, in the beginning, the gods created.
Okay.
And we have to understand when we read the Bible in English, whenever we see the word God or Lord, there's something very specific being used. So I tell all my students to have a good quality interlinear Bible with the English and the Hebrew stacked on top of each other, and then also have a Strong's Concordance that matches that, so that any word they can look up in Strong's Concordance and see every iteration of it and see how it's used. Because Yod-Heh-Vav Eloah name of Tiferet, is very different from Yahweh Zabayot, Lord God of Armies, from Netzach. They're very different forces. Just like the name in the burning bush, Ashar is very different from Adonai. And they're showing different facets of those 10 aspects of deity that are given in the divine names of Absolute.
So those different names of God, would they apply to different spherettes on the tree, or?
Yeah, they're going to. So in each of those 4 worlds, you have 10 spheres, right? For a total of 40 spheres. And this is where, whenever we read the illusion of 40 days, 40 nights, or an alchemical month of 40, or you must be 40 years old to start studying Kabbalah.
Yeah, I heard that.
This is an allusion to an understanding of the tree or life experience of working through all the spheres. It shouldn't be taken literally as the number 40.
And then what about the number 72? Because I think I've heard 72 names of God referenced. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, there's many types of it. The 10 names are the 10 names in Absolute.
Okay.
So each of those spheres is going to have 10 divine names in Absolute. Start from here. 10 divine names in Absolute. In Bria, you're going to have 10 archangels. In Yetzirah, you're going to have 10 choirs of angels. And then in Asiya, you'll have 10 material spheres. So like the actual planet Mars or whatever. Those are the tree of life correspondences, 10 for each one. Now, the 72-fold name of God comes from Exodus. I think it's like chapter 19, verse 19 to 21, something like that.
Okay.
And that's the one that is, those 3 verses are each composed of 72 letters. So you write in Bustaphedron, right to left in one, left to right in the other, right to left in the other. And then you have 72 columns now, right? 72 trigrams. And those trigrams are called the Shem, or the Shemhamphorasch. And that's the 72-fold name of God. This is all totally kosher Kabbalah, by the way. And traditional Kabbalists will meditate in those names as virtues to invoke and inculcate within them those powers or those principles or virtues. If you add the suffix Yah or El, 2 letters, you now get a Tetragrammaton. So it's an angelic name. There's also the 42-fold name of God, a different kind of Shemhamphorasch. Can't remember off the top of my head which book that comes from, but there are definitely different ways of doing this, and they all exemplify different aspects of the one divine truth.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That was going to be my next question. I was going to ask you about the Shemhamphorasch, and then the how do you say it? Boosterphonical writing?
Bustaphedron.
Boosterphedron. Okay. Yeah, in relation to the magic of the Shemhamphorasch. Could you talk a little bit more about the Shemhamphorasch, and then kind of like elaborate on the whole overall intention or message behind that book?
Sure. So in general, like I said, like kosher Kabbalists will most likely work with the the trigrams, the divine names. So Yod Hey Vav, let's just say, throw it out there as a trigram. Whereas in the Golden Dawn or in Elus Coen, you're going to work with those Pentagrammaton angelic forces. And the idea here is to be incorporating 72 aspects of deity, which can then apply to the zodiacal wheel. If you divide a circle into 72 degrees, that's an angel for every 5 days of the year. And by tapping into these angels on a regular basis, you can line yourself up with the macrocosm and the movements of the sun through the universe. You can line yourself up with planetary forces that each one represents. You can use tarot cards that are the tarot minors that apply in the Golden Dawn system to the Shemhamphorasch. And the conception here can be done for the reason of doing it can be a number of reasons. Crowley talks about that to train the body of light, the astral body, that you must learn to travel and communicate on all planes of being, both the positive and the negative. So by having a very structured system such as the Shemhamphorasch, you can experience the totality of the divine world step by step in a very logical way. And again, everything that I do is almost always theurgic. So you're doing this to raise yourself, to purify, consecrate, and cleanse yourself, your perception, your mental abilities, your spiritual capacity, just like flexing a muscle. You know, like if you're going to go to the gym, you're not just going to do biceps all the time. You're going to work your triceps, you're going to work your core, you're going to work your hips, you're going to work your quads. You have to use every part of your being as a muscle. And it's the same conception with doing something as vast and large of an operation as the 72 Shem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's awesome. And I think it kind of reminds me of, I've heard you kind of talk about, this might be related, like the idea of the reintegration or the restoration of the soul in regards to Kabbalah. So I think that kind of like applies.
Absolutely. The concept in Kabbalah of the fall is that man has been splintered, not only man, but the universe. Alchemical writers will say that with the fall of man, he dragged the chain of the elements behind him. And we can see the evidence of a fallen world all around us. There's beauty everywhere, but there's also death, decay, all those kinds of pain, suffering. So the concept of tikkun, that's the Hebrew word, or restoration, or as the Martinists will say, reintegration, is to first restore yourself, to bring your fragmented sparks, your fragmented body of light back together. And that's tikkun hanefesh, restoration of your own soul. Then you can turn around that, and this is likened to the lesser work of alchemy, the work of necessity. Only after the individual has reintegrated themselves can they truly begin the great work, the major operations. And that's the work on the macrocosm of reintegrating the macro. And in Kabbalah, that would be tikkun ha'olam, restoration of the world. And I think people get confused because they try to jump to tikkun ha'olam without having tikkun hanefesh first. It's kind of like one of my analogies I use is when you're on a plane, they always tell you, if the masks come down, put it on yourself first before you put it on your child. Because if you pass out, you're not of use to anyone, right? Or the analogy, you have to fill your cup of water before you can pour to someone else, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think sometimes in spirituality, we have this overly sacrificial conception that we have to do everything for everyone else and sacrifice ourselves all the time. But again, if you have no gas in your tank or you have no water in your cup, how can you fill up someone else's?
Absolutely. 100%.
And that's the way the classical Kabbalah would work. Tikkun ha, restore yourself first, then work on restoring the world.
All right, so let's talk about the OMS, the Order Martinis. How do you pronounce Martinis's sovereigns?
Yeah, Order Martinist. The final S is silent in French. So Order Martinist Souverain. That last is like a kind of a nasal guttural thing. Souverain.
Okay.
So Order Martinist Souverain.
And so let's talk about that, and then Martinism in general. And I think you had mentioned there's 3 branches of Martinism, and then maybe we can kind of get into like the roots of the Elus Coen and talk Elus Coen after that. But yeah,
sure. So Martinism is a very vast tradition. In general, you could say it's a Christian school of the Western esoteric tradition, and it seeks to reawaken in its initiates the knowledge and experience of their own divine origin and their powers, so they may once again exist in the fullness of the divine immensity. And that's a fancy way of saying to restore the fall, the tikkun ha-nefesh, tikkun ha-olam, like we talked about earlier. And Martinists don't seek to do this just for themselves. They do the tikkun ha-nefesh, restore the self, and then seek to reintegrate and raise the fallen world in general. Now, this grew out of 1750s French Freemasonry. It was one of the first haute grade or high grade systems that came out of France, and was founded by a guy named Martin de Pasquale, or more fully, Jacques Lévin Joachim de la Tour de la Casse Martin de Pasquale. Like, imagine being a kid and having to learn cursive writing that name out, right?
That's like Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheimer.
Yeah, even longer.
Crazy name.
So his origins are kind of clouded in obscurity, but he was probably born of Spanish immigrated parents. His family's probably converted Jews, and it seems that his father was consecrated by supposedly Prince of Bonnie Charlie, Charles Edward Stuart II, and that in his role as Jacobite Grand Master of all Masons of England, Ireland, and Scotland, he gave his father, Pasquale's father, a patent that was bequeathable to his son. And Pasquale, at a very young age, was involved in these things. We're not really sure where it all came from. Obviously, Jacobite Masonry, but perhaps his family might have been inquisitors in a previous time and didn't burn the books and still retained that information. But he created a high-grade Masonic system that broke the bonds of what we know as normal Freemasonry. And his Elus Coen was the first manifestation. Elus Coen means elect priests. And their full name is L'Ordre des Chevaliers Masons et le Coin de l'Univers, or the Order of the Knights Masons, Elect Priests of the Universe. Kind of a haughty title, right? But essentially what he did is he reconfigured the Masonic mythos, the Masonic structure, in a non-Hiramic legend. So it takes on a more Adamic or Noahite perspective.
Is Hiramic, is that in reference to Hiram Abiff?
Exactly. Hiram does not figure into the Elus Coen mythology at all.
Okay.
It works a biblical progression, beginning with Adam, progressing into his sons Cain and Abel, and the first murder, progressing into Noah, and an alchemical experience of the Ark of the Covenant, progressing into Abraham and his sacrifices, and then into Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, out of bondage, eventually to the Holy Land. And then we have another exile. We have the Babylonian exile, right? So it progresses into Zerubbabel and his return of the Israelites with permission of King Cyrus, and finally results in the illumination of the New Testament under the final degree, Roi, which brings on a very mystical Christian character. So this order was magical, Kabbalistic, ceremonial magic in orientation, very grimoire. His students were studying the Megaton, the Ars Goetia. They were studying all those classical grimoires with classical Kabbalah and Pasquale's own kind of midrash. His only true book, Reintegration of Beings, is kind of like a modern day Zohar. It's like a modern midrash on the Pentateuch, on the 5 books of Moses, and how that can be used as an initiatory journey. And it was very visceral. It's very, it can be kind of bloody too. Very visceral, very aggressive, and a very difficult system to work through. But it's also known under its 2 other branches, which were developed by 2 of his primary students, namely Jean-Baptiste Willermoz and Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. Willermoz was chosen in 1778 to revise the Strict Observance, which was a high-grade Templar Masonic system founded by Baron von Hund. Long story short, when von Hund died, there was a big void to be filled, and the Strict Observance fell apart for a number of reasons. So Willermoz goes to the Convention of Wilhelmsbad in 1778, and essentially all the Masonic rites of Europe are coming together to kind of duke it out on who's going to be the next official rite of European Masonry. And Willermoz won with his aid of the Philoletes and the Swedenborgians and things like that. And he revised the strict observance into the rectified Scottish Rite. And that's the first time we hear that term, Scottish Rite. And a lot of our Scottish Rite degrees nowadays come from this convention or filtered down from Willermo's. He took the Pasquale magical Masonic myth and codified it into masonry, regular masonry, that would now be palatable and something that would last for generations and still around to this day. It had a secret inner order, which still retained the Templar symbolism of the strict observance, and had a secret inner order that prepared the candidates for Elus Coen magical workings and operative ceremonial magic. So in that sense, he helped to survive the Coen. Saint Martin, on the other hand, he was a member of both. He helped to develop the rectified Scottish Rite and CBCS with Willermo's. But around 1790, 1792, something like that, he asked to be stricken from all Masonic records. He resigned from Freemasonry forever. And this is where you get the conception that he quit the Coen and that he wasn't a magician and that he was anti-magic. And this is just, it's total fodder that people reading secondary and tertiary sources are perpetuating. In reality, he was a Coen until the day he died. And in reality, Willermo's was often jealous of Saint Martin because Saint Martin attained visions and passes and had such natural adepthood in magic, whereas for Willermo's is very difficult. What Saint Martin did, though, in his later years, is he started focusing on writing and writing mystical Christian treatises and bringing together his society of friends, a society of intimates or intimates or initiates, and instructing them mouth to ear in a very Gnostic, Kabbalistic way. So he never made an order himself, but 140 years later, Dr. Girardin Cosse, also known as Papus or Papus, he developed the Martinist order in France. And that is where most people understand the term Martinism is from someone that wasn't even involved in the original system. He wasn't even alive, but he codified it into the modern 3-degree system that most people know as Martinism. And the OMS, we seek to unify all three of those branches and to not just do what everyone else has been doing for the past 200 years, but we're going back to all the original source manuscripts and resourcing all the Elus Coen initiations, the CBCS, the Grand Profess, the magical work from original primary sources rather than doing the reconstructions that occurred in the middle in World War II.
Wow.
And we started 2013, Friday 13th, and now we have, I think, 13 temples around the world. And that's most of my travels. When we see me traveling, I'm usually founding a temple or visiting a temple or doing something like that.
Wow, that's fascinating. Maybe this might be a cool part to get your. What I want to ask you, what is the difference between thaumaturgy and theurgy?
Sure. So theurgy is going to be pretty much explicitly what Saint Martin and Pasquale prescribe. Theurgy is the act of using divine forces, divine names, divine powers to transform oneself, to alchemically, or you could even say yogically, inculcate the virtues, like we were talking about with the Shem. You're seeking to make your body, your soul, your spirit a fit vessel for the divine light. And because of that, there will have to be adjustments made to your personality, to your lifestyle, to your views, to your soul. And the conception there is that theurgy, you're changing yourself, making yourself a better, more virtuous vessel. And by doing that, you will naturally have reaction from the macrocosm, the world, in which your life will improve, or certain things you want to have happen will naturally occur. Whereas theurgy or thaumaturgy is the conception of changing the world. So that's like doing spells and witchcraft and making things happen externally to you. But because of the nature of the relationship between self and other, or microcosm and macrocosm, you and the world, whichever one shifts, there's going to have to be a shift on the other because they're symbiotic, right? So, for example, with thaumaturgy, one of the examples I would tell my students in the Golden Dawn is, all right, you want to do some thaumaturgy? Go do a $50 ritual. Go do a ritual saying you want $50 to come into your life. Don't do a 5,000, because just wait to see what happens. See what your relationship is in the microcosm. Because often what will happen is something will break that costs $50. And I tell them to use a specific number, like 43.96, so you can recognize it when it manifests. Because often something bad will happen, and then you have to generate that money in order to pay for that. So you got what you asked for, but not in the way you expected. Like let's say you do a ritual for $50,000 and your grandma dies, and then you inherit $50,000. You're like, well, I got it, but I don't want my grandma to die.
Yeah.
A much better approach would be, like, theurgically, we could say, okay, I want to make more money. Do I need to go back to school? Do I need to change my job? Do I need to go fill out a job application? I knew people in the Golden Dawn that would spend all day doing job rituals, and then they never go out and apply for a job. It's like, it's not going to come to you. You got to go put in the steps. It'd be more effective. This isn't actual thaumaturgy, but we could say your theurgy would be you drafting your new resume or going to school, getting an education, going and pursuing that naturally rather than forcing nature to do something. Because nature's always going to take the easiest path, like water going down a mountain.
Definitely. Yeah. And you mentioned alchemy. It's a pretty big focal point of my podcast and all of its various forms.
Yeah, a lot of your guests are very alchemically minded.
Yeah. And I've come to find that there's multiple alchemies, all of which I'm curious about. And you've done an excellent video on the alchemical process of the Elus Coen. Maybe you could just touch on that one a little bit.
Sure. The Elus Coen alchemical process is radically different from the general spagyric mineral plant alchemy that most people work on, as well as the spiritual alchemy that we're mostly used to. I would start with saying, as far as literal laboratory alchemy, the only experience I have is spagyrics, so vegetable alchemy, plant alchemy, taking an herb and macerating, breaking it down, macerating it, soaking it, extracting it, burning it, doing solution with it, and eventually imbibing it. And I have a book on that anyone can have a free PDF if they like to check it out. Operation of the 7 Planetary Spagyrics. And that's a very useful tool to integrate higher powers of the planets and to see a physical process occur before you that you can track your inner progress with. Now, spiritual alchemy is really what I focus on primarily. So working with alchemical plates, alchemical series from people like Malleus, the Azoth series, Basil Valentine, Book of Lambspring, Splendor Solus. Inner alchemy is really where it's at for me. And that can be akin to Jungian depth psychology, the process of individuation, using these planets as aspects of yourself, just like in Kabbalah, you'd use the planets or the Ruach as aspects of your personality. I actually gave a lecture on this at the Scottish Rite last night in Austin, in relation to the 27th degree. And then the Elus Coen does something different, where their alchemy is using their specific understanding of salt, sulfur, and mercury. And they use that to exemplify 3 types of spirits or spiritual archetypes within the material and spiritual world. So it's a much different process, but they're all akin to each other and all kindred spirits.
That's really interesting.
And for me, my alchemy goes hand in hand with Kabbalah.
Yeah. So it's something I'm kind of totally like not really familiar with, but so say something like it has a spirit attached to salt, sulfur, and mercury. Is that what you're saying? So
yeah, they're in the Elus Coen, they're like classes of spirits.
Oh, okay.
So sulfur represents the spirits of the central fire axis in the Martinist tradition. So they'd be like the spirits of the ring past not, the secret fire of the universe, that which gives life and movement to all things. Whereas the aquatic spirits of the crystalline waters temper and cool that fire, so it doesn't just burn everything out.
Oh.
And then you finally have the terrestrial or elemental spirits of Mercury, which is different. He applies Mercury to earth and to the bones in a very different way than most alchemical writers would. That becomes the material body. That becomes the elements themselves, like earth specifically, but the physical elements themselves. So the concept in the 5th, 6th, and 7th degrees of Elus Coen, which most orders, actually, I think we're probably the only one that does those degrees, right? The concept there is that you are reintegrating those forces so you can begin working with them and operating on them on a macrocosmic level.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I think
And
it's
that's
been
after
mentioned.
doing all the preparatory work of the first 4 grades, which is
Wow.
integrating the powers of your own being and your holy guardian angel.
Okay. Yeah, that's really cool. I think it's been mentioned a few times with some previous guests of mine. They've kind of described Freemasonry as a system of morality veiled in allegory illustrated by symbols. So I was curious of your assessment of morality. Would you say that it's objective or relative?
That is a very good question. And the answer you gave there is the general stock answer that people give for Freemasonry. Morality, it's principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Values of conduct, principles of conduct. I definitely think there is objective good and evil in the world, but I think that some things are just downright evil. And philosophers have been debating this since time immemorial, if there's true evil or not in the world. And all I got to say is you look at, child molestation, murder, and like, how can that not be objectively evil, right? Now, in the case of slaying someone, sometimes those things might be necessary. There might be times in war, where something like that is permissible, or there might be times where you're defending yourself or your family, your child, and the greater good is to slay this evil criminal person before you. So I think that whenever we deal with conceptions of right and wrong and morality, that there is definitely a subjective nature that needs to come into mind. And I think that as we develop as magicians and occultists, those conceptions of right and wrong will definitely change. Aleister Crowley is a great example of this. He's considered the wickedest man in the world by the 1920 standards. Nowadays, he wouldn't even be that big of a deal. Like, oh, okay, yeah, that's totally acceptable now. Like most of the things he did. But so that's an example of how morality has shifted, right? Objective morality back then, the things he was doing were considered extremely profane, were considered bacchanalian. Nowadays, it's pretty much the standard norm around a lot of the world.
Yeah, it's a
So,
fascinating just thing to contemplate. I've been kind of thinking about it lately. It's just, yeah, it's interesting. Like you're saying, with it shifting over time, and
right.
I just like to get
Because
different
morality is
opinions.
shaped by our cultures, our religion, our country, our time and space, your social class as well. And we should always have to keep that in mind when we consider that.
Yeah,
But there is, in my mind, an objective morality out there, a divine morality of right and wrong. And for me, it's learning what your inner compass is and learning how to guide that inner compass and be guided not necessarily by conscience, because conscience is also a product of your society and your upbringing and all of those things. But your inner compass, which I would akin more to intuition and the feminine principle, perhaps of Bria or even absolute. And that as we attune ourselves spiritually to our highest self and to the divine, we can come closer to that true East, where true morality comes from, where you have a timeless morality of right and wrong.
That's interesting.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Now, why is it designated towards the east?
East is it's the general term we say for the rising of the sun, right?
Oh, okay.
From the eternal East, whence comes all light and all life, the dawning of the sun, as opposed to the darkness of the West.
Okay, I was thinking
the Coen works.
I was thinking true north. People say true north often, but that makes actually sense with the rising of the sun, true east. So that's cool.
Yep. Yes, sir.
So two of my favorite words, I would say freedom and sovereignty. And the OMS, there's obviously that sovereign in the name. Maybe could you talk to me a little bit about what it means to you in terms of the order itself, or just in general, just the idea of sovereignty?
Yeah. So I think that free will is absolutely paramount. I think that it is, according to Judeo-Christian philosophy, free will is what made Adam so much different from every other created being, whether we're talking angels, archangels, spirits, or animals. that mankind is in a unique position of free will. Pasquale talks about how the universe is composed of these beings set into motion that are kind of like the machinery of the universe. Gnosticism might use a term. Some forms of Gnosticism might use archons, but maybe think of them as just programs, things set into motion. Whereas man has the ability to choose for himself his operation, has the ability to choose right and wrong, has the ability to choose left or right, up, down, whatever. And that's what makes us unique. So we need to cherish and honor that free will within us. But again, our free will might not be so much our free will if we're acting on our conditioning, right? We might think we're making a decision on our own, but it's actually coming from our neuroses, our psychological hangups, our society. So sovereignty is a term for kings, right? A term for kings, princes, for the sovereign of a nation, the independent ruler who is infallible. And not saying we're infallible anyway, but the concept is to attune your spirituality to a degree, but where you can actually have that true free will and follow what Crowley would call the true will, where you're consciously making your decisions and actions. And that's the sovereignty we are seeking to inculcate and to nurture within our members of the LMS. We say that we are an order formed of sovereigns with the purpose of raising other sovereigns, raising and elevating other sovereigns. And I would say that most people can't even begin to understand what that looks like until further down the path, because we're still stuck in our society's conceptions thereof.
Yeah. And you mentioned the true will, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people, we hear this, do what thou wilt, and I've heard it represented in a couple different ways, and some of the people that talk about the actual meaning behind that was more aligned with a more divine will. I don't know if that's kind of your understanding in terms of like the thelemic notion, or what would you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that unfortunately, Crowley was a genius, in my opinion. And there's a lot of problems too, right? He's not a role model necessarily, but he's one of the few adepts who actually very clearly wrote and showed a way to adepthood, but not only to adepthood, but the steps after adepthood to mastery and to sovereignty. And when people say do what thou wilt should be the whole law, you need to follow up with the rest of that phrase. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will. Now, what is the difference between your lower will and the true will? Like you said, the divine will, that's what I interpret that as. The true will is the divine will. And do what thou wilt. That thou should be a capital T. So you have to have integrated your divine self to understand the nature of what your will even is, so that you're, again, not being an automaton, not being just guided by your conditioning. And that will is akin to the same kind of sovereignty that I was talking about. That is the will to be like deity, to be giving, to be good, and to make conscious decisions as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that gets bastardized a lot.
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's a guy, Mark Passio, when he talks about that, he says, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the Crowley's teachings, you know?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this next one,
his Book of Lies, for example, is just like, it's like a comedy book, but it's just loaded with divine truth. And if you can get through it and like meditate on that on a regular basis, it'll really open up some amazing avenues.
Yeah. All right, so this next one is it's gonna be kind of fun. I'll preface it with, there's good apples and there's bad apples in all groups.
Sure.
So there's a bad apple or two. It's not representative of the whole. So anyway, so there's this lodge called the P2 Lodge, or Propaganda Do. It's a Masonic lodge under the Grand Orient of Italy, or the Grand Loggia d'Italia. I guess this was considered somewhat of a clandestine Masonic lodge and known as the Mother Church of the Jesuits or something like that. So there's this guy, Lucio Gelli. I guess he was the alleged venerable master. At least that's what you can read online in some places if you look it up. And so I guess the CIA, or maybe at this time it was the OSS, they paid this guy like 10 million a month to direct an anti-communist network or something along these lines. But so yeah, he was connected to this guy named uh, Giulio Andrade, who was the son of the Pope. And
Okay.
I guess actually the real Grandmaster, at least this is according to this guy named Leo Zagami, this Italian author. He was initiated under in the Monte Carlo Lodge by a Sicilian prince named Giovanni Alatia di Montreale. So I guess this Giovanni and Andreotti, they were in this group called the Ring. So I was listening to this interview with this Leo Zagami, and he talks about his knowledge about this, and he says that Giovanni Alata di Montreal was a member with his grandfather in the National Monarchical Party. So I guess Giovanni was a sovereign grand commander of the RSAA from 55 to 60, and then in 78 he created the Supreme Council of the 33. Then later he formed something called the Noble Association of the Holy Roman Empire and was a master of the Illuminati of the New World Order. So there's that, and then there's this dude, Giuliano di Bernardo. There's a website called dignityorder.com where you can read all about him and his like extensive biography. He's the Grand Master of this order, and like on his biography, if you scroll down, I'll quote what it says. It says, 2002, he founded the Academy of the Illuminati with its headquarters in Piazza di Spagna, Rome. Eminent philosophers, scientists, jurists, economists, artists, men of letters, political scientists, communicators, laymen, clerical joined the academy in Italy and abroad. Towards the end, it talks about an esoteric order denominated by him. It's an international order founded in Italy and in which then spread out worldwide. So in previous interviews, I've talked with Johnny Royal, who's awesome Freemason filmmaker. Shout out to Johnny. He created a couple of films I watched, I think Illuminated and 33 and Beyond, which
He and I actually
featured.
have a TV show that's coming out
I'm
in the near future.
excited about that one. I think he had mentioned
Yeah.
that. So I
Yeah.
think he kind of went, into this documentary, based on like Adam Weishaupt, and the kind of concludes with the assessment that the Illuminati fizzled out and didn't really go anywhere. But it kind of seems like, and I don't know if all this is like, because who knows, maybe this is like a total, just some website built or whatever, but it kind of seems like it potentially may have lived on in some capacity or morphed. And so I just wanted to get your opinion, if you have any insight or like into like the Illuminati or where it may have gone or anything like that.
Sure. So let me preface first. I don't know a lot about the P2 Lodge. I know that it was a big Italian scandal in the 70s or something like that. But what I do know is that the Illuminati themselves, the actual Bavarian Illuminati, is very well documented under Joe Wage's books, and that the original order, they were actually one of the ones battling against Willermoes and the Martinists in the 1778 Convention of Wilhelmsbad. And essentially, when Willermoes won that battle and the Rectified Scottish Rite and CBCS became the ruling body, the one that came out on top at the convention, that the Illuminati itself fizzled out pretty darn quick. Now, there were elements of the original Bavarian Illuminati combined with members of the Swedish Rite and the CBCS that did form other groups, such in Sweden, for example. But it was not at all the kind of Illuminati people think. And if people want to study the real Illuminati, I would stay off the internet and those kinds of like websites with a guy trying to look like Anton LaVey and talk about Satan conspiracies, and actually go read the real source texts and see that they were a quasi-Masonic order, and they essentially were preaching rationalism in the age of science and the denial of the divinity of Christ, things like this. it's totally not, because they're in favor of rational science as opposed to mysticism and religion. Like that's all established. But I never saw anything in there that's nefarious. I saw just an Enlightenment era Masonic society. That's what I think the Illuminati is. And whenever anyone on the street asks me about the Illuminati, they're always informed by these crackpot conspiracy theories websites. The Illuminati did not survive. Now, a lot of organizations and spurious individuals have used that name in order to try to give themselves credibility, but it's all rubbish in my opinion. And none of them know what the fuck they're talking about. They don't. They're not esotericists. They're not occultists. They don't know the real history. They're just requoting bad conspiracy theorists, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's much more interesting to study the real material, in my opinion.
Definitely. Yeah, the conversation I had with Johnny, definitely, like, I was like, I don't really see too much here that's so scandalous. But
yeah.
So
they definitely had heretical views. I mean, but heresy is kind of the name of the game, right?
Right. Okay, so I want to get your thoughts on this. Is something that's come up a few times for me. Gnosticism versus Hermeticism, and maybe some of the similarities and then some of the big differences, like in your opinion, from your research.
Sure. So first of all, I think that when we talk about Gnosticism, we have to define our terms. Gnosticism is a huge wide umbrella. You had pre-Jewish Gnostics, you had Jewish Gnostics, you had Christian Gnostics. And all three of those are going to have very different interpretations. All of those are going to have different myths, different deities, different background stories. So first of all, it's wrong to label everything as Gnosticism. When I use the term Gnosticism, I'm usually referring to Sethian Gnosticism, which has a very alchemical and Kabbalistic bend to it as well. And I have a video intro. Oh man, I don't know. I have some videos intro to like Gnosticism or something like that. I think it's Intro to Martinism Part 5, The History of the Gnostic Church, where I break down step by step the Sethian Barbalite Gnostic creation myth and show how it is very closely linked to Kabbalah and very closely linked to Hermeticism. And I think people get too stuck on, just like we were talking about systems, they get too stuck in like one rigid mindset instead of allowing these traditions to inform each other and see similarities, see how this is trying to say it in this way. This is saying the same thing in that way. This might use a different name. This might use the name Eleleth. This might use the name Elohim, but how they're essentially saying the core same myth and principle. And I'm very big to use the term myth as opposed to gospel or truth. I always like the term legend for the same reason.
I'm with you on that.
But yeah, and I think that writers need to clarify when they're saying a myth and a legend as opposed to, no, Adam did this. It's like, really? Like, come on, man. Now, when you take a wide angle zoom and you have a deeper study of Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, I think they all cross-reference each other. I think they all blend together rather well. And in the OMS, we utilize all forms of the streams. Hermeticism properly, you could say, and again, that needs defining too. Are we talking about Hellenic Hermeticism? Are we talking about like the writings of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is going to be, the Hellenic occupation of Egypt era? Or are we talking about the Hermeticism of the Middle Ages when they first started reviving these texts and Hermeticism was a blanket for all forms of magic, Kabbalah, and alchemy, right? But when you really break it down, I think they're all going towards the same goal, including Rosicrucianism. And oftentimes people will pit Rosicrucianism and Gnosticism against each other, or they'll pit Catholicism and this against each other, Jacobites versus Protestants. But you got to understand, there's Catholic Jacobites, there's Protestant Jacobites, there's Jew Jacobites. The lines have never been clear and cut either one way. So I think that we need to suspend judgment and actually take a deeper dive into these things rather than just saying verses. I think they're all dealing with the same conception of the nature of the universe, of God, man, and the universe. They're all using occult concepts. They're all using ancient religions and traditions and mythologies. We're using magical techniques. We're using alchemical techniques. And there's a lot more in common than they have different. And that's kind of how I approach life in general. Is like, as humans, we have more in common than we have different. And if we can recognize the similarities on political levels of gender, sex, relationships, that a lot of the world's problems would start to dissipate away as we unite into a common mass again.
Amen to that. I'm with you.
Yeah, man. Getting pro at this.
All right. So the next thing I want to ask you about was hedonism. This is a term. I mean, I'm sure many people have heard it. It sounds very negative, I guess. At least I kind of had that kind of vibe from it. I'm just curious,
Sure.
you know, what is what's the classical understanding of hedonism and compared to maybe what most people think of when they hear hedonism?
See, when I studied philosophy in college, I definitely learned to have an affinity for hedonism, and by that I mean the classical understanding. And it's basically the conception that pleasure or seeking goodness, the good, should be the central role in your motivating factor, right? Seeking pleasure, satisfaction of desires. Now, the nature of desires makes a big difference, right? Now, in general, I think most society thinks hedonism. They think of bacchanalian orgies and excess in wine and drink and all that kind of stuff, right? And sure, there's definitely an element of that in ancient Greece. But for me, hedonism, like we're talking about with tikkun and true will, once you understand really what your goal is in life, what your purpose is, to pursue that. And I do want to pursue increased pleasure and decreased pain. But the problem with hedonism is it tends to get lumped into selfishness, right? Into doing things just for yourself at the expense of others. And as a Rosicrucian, if you temper that with trying to do good towards others, healing the sick pro bono, abiding in the customs of the country in which you reside, take care of the weak, the sick, the orphans, the widows, things like that, then you have a much more balanced perspective in which to lay your moral philosophical foundation. So for me, hedonism can be much cleaner than the way people describe it. And there's different types of hedonism too, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
how I lay that out there?
It does. One thing I'm curious about when you say that, say, I think you said abiding in the customs of the country of which you reside.
It's one of the Rosicrucian maxims.
Would customs, would that apply to like the laws of the country?
Yeah. So
Okay.
the idea of Rosicrucianism is to be an unknown amongst your peers, right? So think about the phrase that anyone can be holy sitting at the top of a mountain alone. You know, you go to a monastery and sit and meditate all day. You know, it's going to be really easy to block out distractions and feel so holy and noble, right? But really, you're just alone. You don't have to deal with anything.
Yeah.
It's much harder. Rosicrucians talk about it's much harder and therefore much more virtuous to be living down in the city, in the town, in the village, dealing with people's problems day in, day out, helping with others, contributing to society, rather than just hiding yourself away on the top of a mountain.
Yeah.
And in that sense, the Rosicrucians, if you're traveling into an Islamic country, then maybe you should fucking conform to their laws and customs so you don't get killed, for one. And that's not against Islam; it's against any tradition.
Right.
That was just what I picked. And that you respect the culture in which you reside. You'll get much more Rosicrucian work done if you get along with the people, if you are able to cloak yourself in their traditions and their allegories. And yeah, you'll get a lot more done if you follow the laws and customs and don't end up in jail, which is going to really stunt your ability as a Rosicrucian to tikkun olam.
Definitely. It's really cool to see kind of how the different systems and orders complement each other, like, and how you can build upon them, and you know, from say Rosicrucianism to Freemasonry to whatever.
Right.
So that's really cool.
I mean, you could say that hedonism, the idea of pursuing pleasure and reducing suffering, can be similar to that of the first noble truth in Buddhism, that, you know, existence is suffering, so we should try to mitigate that suffering. Now, the truth is you can never get rid of suffering. You're always going to have an element of that. But I definitely live a more hedonic lifestyle where I seek to enjoy the beauty of being out in nature. Hedonism doesn't have to be these extreme things that people think of with it. It can be reading a good book, having a good glass of tea, watching the sunset, going on a hike. All these hedonism can also be going out and volunteering at a shelter. You get pleasure out of doing that. And this brings up the concept of altruism. Is there true altruism in the world? Because if you feel good doing it, aren't you getting something out of it then? Right? So it's not truly altruistic now. Even martyrdom. Well, okay, you just sacrifice yourself for your ideals, but you think you're getting something out of it, and you're becoming a martyr out of it. So is it truly altruistic even? And again, like we were saying with Gnosticism and comparing Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, there's no hard and fast line for any of this. We have to keep our minds flexible. And one thing I tell my students is to be able to hold two opposing viewpoints in your mind at the same time. Because by holding two opposing viewpoints, you can find that third that reconciles them.
Absolutely. Okay, so in terms of like laws, say like something like natural law, like in your life, do you explore the knowledge and understanding of natural law? And if so, I'm curious if you would describe what natural law means or is to you.
Yeah, I mean, natural law it's the foundation of occultism, right? It's the foundation of being able to have correspondences with the material world that have spiritual correspondences in the spiritual world. It's the foundation of the alchemical maxim, the Hermetic maxim: the things which are above are a reflection of things which are below. Things which are below are a reflection of things which are above for the accomplishment of the one work. That's that third point, right? As above, so below. But there's always that third point. Natural philosophy is the essence of occultism, the essence of Kabbalah and magic. It's also the essence of the American transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau. And I think that man has always used nature to try to understand reality. It's our first teacher, and it's where we come from and where we're going. From the dust you came, from the dust of earth you shall return. So natural law, I think, will always trump human law, but that doesn't mean. And there can be unjust laws. Being a Rosicrucian doesn't mean follow the unjust laws, but it means learn to be unknown, learn to cloak yourself, learn to find the ways where you can have the most influence. And I think by studying natural law, we can learn how to fall more in alignment with the spiritual world.
All right. My last question is, if you, in terms of what you hold in high regard, what would you say is the highest of all? May that be self-preservation, truth. What would you hold in the highest regard at the top of whatever it is that you deem the thing to be strived for?
Right. So, I mean, I think that's definitely a subjective question, right? Highest good's also been called the summum bonum, which is a term for the philosopher's stone. True wisdom and perfect happiness, as the Golden Dawn calls it. Now, true wisdom and perfect happiness are not hedonic. That kind of happiness isn't just pleasure seeking. It's a pleasure based on true happiness, on fulfillment, on balance, on contentment. So I think in that sense, what I've always aimed my life after is wisdom, understanding, love, and equality and fairness with my fellow human being, right? Sure, there's times where someone must lead and someone must follow. Not everyone can be the chief, right? But finding a balance with those things. Think about Taoism or Zen Buddhism. Out of all the philosophies, I would probably say I'm more of a Taoist than anything. The way I try to live my life, there's always going to be, there's a yin and yang to everything. There's a white and a black, there's light and a dark. Every one of our actions can have positive and negative consequences. But if we're trying to see the totality of the whole, how your actions affect the other, how the other affects you, and seeking good, seeking pleasure, seeking happiness within that understanding, that'll temper a lot of those selfish, egotistical things that might come out of egoism or might come out of hedonism.
That's actually cool that you mentioned the Taoism. That's something I've been kind of getting interested in recently, is understanding these like the various cycles. Like there's like the Shang cycle or the Qi cycle and all of that. In the terms of how I think they have like a 5 elemental system versus like the Hermetic common like 4 elemental system. But I was curious, are you familiar with any of that? And
Yeah, I don't study. I mean, I've studied a little bit of Taoist alchemy.
yeah.
I follow more just the classical texts of Lao Tzu, the and then the I Ching, the Book of Changes, how everything morphs into its opposite. So don't be so attached to any one thing because it will eventually morph into its opposite. Your life will become your death.
Mm.
You know, that which too much of any good becomes bad. Too much vitamin C is bad for you,
Yeah.
right? You know, too much water, you'll actually dehydrate yourself. You know, you can actually sap the minerals from your body. So it's all about finding that balance. And that's why I based my martial arts and yoga company, Prana Masters Academy, Prana Martial Arts and Yoga, off of Taoism. And that's why the logos are all based around the yin yang, the Tao, is to always be seeking that balance between the white and the black, you know, and know that it's always flowing and changing between them, between each other. Everything flows into its opposite. So for me, it's really I Ching, Tao Te Ching, the writings Confucius is what I try to gear my personal day-to-day philosophy after.
Awesome. All right. Well,
And
I
it
just
reduces all this heavy Kabbalah and stuff into something very simple.
yeah, definitely. Well, I want to say that this was a really awesome interview for me, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time. Do
Thank
you
you
have
very much for
any?
having me on, Scott.
Absolutely. Do you have any last messages or anything that you want to put out there for the listeners to be aware of, or anything?
If they'd like to follow me, I'm on all the usual channels, Paul Edward Rana, or the easiest way is to go to my Linktree/Ninja Paul. Really easy to remember, Linktree/Ninja Paul, and there you can find all my social media. You can find my YouTube that probably has about 60 or 70 hours of esoteric lectures and videos on there,
Gold mine.
ranging from gold mine, right? There's also my my bookstore on there where you can buy all of my books and my translations and Martinist writings. I have some new French Rosicrucian stuff coming out soon as well. You can also check out my academia where you can see a lot of free documents and papers I've written there. And just reach out. And if anyone's interested in Martinism, check out the Linktree/Martinism. And there's a wealth of information there. Start with the download OMS aspirants document. Brings you to a folder on Mega.
All right. Paul, thank you so much. Greatly.
Rock on. Thanks for having me here.
Till next time.
Mr. Sky. You bet. Till next time, catch you on the flip side.
All right.